The morning began like any other, a quiet, peaceful start to the day. The sun hung low in the sky, casting soft golden light that filtered through the windows of the greenhouse, creating dancing shadows on the floor. Maria stood among her orchids, their delicate petals opening to greet the day, each one a small triumph of life. In this space, surrounded by the soft hum of nature, Maria found a fleeting sense of peace. For as long as she could remember, her garden had been her refuge, a sanctuary of sorts, where she could lose herself in the rhythm of tending to her plants. Here, she didn't have to confront the overwhelming emptiness that seemed to seep into every corner of her life after her husband's death. The loss of him had left a void she could neither fill nor understand. In the years since, Maria had buried herself in work, convinced that if she kept herself busy, the grief would somehow lessen. But grief doesn't work that way. It doesn't fade with time or effort. It lingers quietly in the spaces where you least expect it. And as she knelt down to adjust the soil of a plant, the sharp sting of pain in her lower back jolted her out of her thoughts. For a moment, the world around her seemed to pause. The garden, once her solace, faded into the background as a wave of discomfort rippled through her body. The pain was immediate, fierce and unsettling, reminding her that her body, no matter how well she took care of it, was fragile. In that moment, she wasn't just facing the physical pain of aging. She was confronted with a deeper truth that she had been avoiding for far too long. She couldn't do everything alone anymore. Maria had always prided herself on her independence. She was the woman who could handle everything, the responsibilities, the emotions, the burdens of life. She didn't need anyone else, or so she convinced herself. But as the pain twisted through her spine, she felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. She wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for a long time. The weight of her own pride, her self-sufficiency, had become a burden in itself. It kept her isolated, convinced that she had to be strong, that to need others was a weakness. Yet here she was in a moment of vulnerability, realizing how much she longed for something she had pushed aside for years: connection. It wasn't just the pain that unsettled her, it was the realization that she had been living in a kind of emotional exile, telling herself that she didn't need help, that she didn't need to lean on anyone. But in the quiet of the greenhouse, with the scent of fresh soil and the soft rustling of leaves, Maria understood. The real strength came from allowing others to care for you, to share your burdens. She had spent so long convincing herself that she had to weather the storms alone, but now she saw the truth. Vulnerability wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the bridge that connected us all, the shared experience that bound us together in our humanity. For the first time in a long time, Maria allowed herself to feel what she had been too proud to admit. She wasn't just tired, she was longing for something more, longing to be seen, to be cared for. And in that simple, fragile moment, Maria realized that letting go of her pride, opening herself to others, was the beginning of healing, not just for her body, but for her heart as well. The pain came unexpectedly, like a sharp, uninvited reminder of her own fragility. Maria had been so absorbed in her work, so lost in the comfort of routine, that she didn't see it coming. One moment she was tending to her beloved orchids, feeling the soft dirt between her fingers, the quiet of the garden surrounding her like a warm embrace. And the next, a piercing pain shot through her lower back, robbing her of breath and leaving her frozen in place. It wasn't just the physical sensation that took her by surprise, it was the sudden shift in her reality, the moment when she realized that the body she had once taken for granted was no longer invincible. The sharpness of the pain cut through her self-sufficiency, tearing down the facade she had so carefully built over the years. Maria had lived most of her life under the belief that she didn't need anyone. After her husband passed, she became more resolute in her independence, telling herself that if she could keep busy, if she could keep moving, she wouldn't have to confront the emptiness that had settled deep within her. She worked tirelessly, filling every moment with something to do, something to focus on, anything to avoid the ache of loss. But now, standing in the garden, clutching the workbench as the pain radiated through her body, Maria realized just how deeply she had neglected herself. Her body, like her heart, had been pushed too far. She had ignored the subtle signs, the tightening of her muscles, the constant exhaustion, the small aches and pains that were ignored in favor of continuing to move forward, to carry on as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. The weight of her own vulnerability had finally caught up with her. For years she had prided herself on being strong, on being able to handle everything on her own. She told herself that independence was a virtue, that she didn't need to rely on anyone, that she could handle her grief alone. But now, as the sharp pain continued to pulse in her lower back, Maria felt something shift deep within her. This wasn't just a physical pain, it was an emotional awakening, an invitation to finally face the truth she had been running from. She couldn't do it all on her own. She wasn't invincible. Her pride, which had once served as armor against the world, now felt like a burden too heavy to carry any longer. In that moment, Maria saw the fragility of the illusion she had built. She had spent so many years convincing herself that strength meant doing everything alone, but now she understood that true strength came from allowing herself to be vulnerable, from letting others in. It wasn't weakness to ask for help, it was human. The pain in her back wasn't just a reminder of her body's limits. It was the beginning of her realization that to heal, she needed to let go of the walls she had built around herself. For so long, she had denied herself the care and connection that others offered, too afraid to admit that she too needed support. But now, standing in the garden, as the world continued to turn around her, Maria made a silent promise to herself. She would no longer let pride keep her isolated. The first step toward healing wasn't fixing what was broken, but allowing herself to be seen, to be cared for, and to finally let go of the belief that she had to bear everything alone. As Maria stood there, grappling with the realization of her own fragility, a voice broke through the silence, gentle yet firm. It was Isaac, her nephew, stepping into the greenhouse with an air of concern that seemed to soften the sharpness of her discomfort. He was younger than her, only in his mid-20s, but in his eyes Maria saw something that caught her off guard, a genuine, unwavering care that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Isaac's presence was a balm to her racing thoughts. He had always been someone she could count on, a quiet constant in her life, but in this moment his concern was different. It wasn't just about the garden or the plants or the usual exchange of pleasantries. Isaac could see something beneath the surface, something she had been trying so desperately to hide. His eyes, soft with worry, lingered on her, and without a word he took a step closer. "Maria, are you okay?" His voice was filled with a tenderness that made her chest tighten. She opened her mouth to respond, to offer the usual mask of "I'm fine," but the words caught in her throat. The lie felt too heavy. How could she possibly pretend that she was okay when her body, her heart, and her mind were all telling her otherwise? For a fleeting moment, Maria wanted to retreat, to push him away, to maintain the facade of self-sufficiency she had held onto for so long. She had become accustomed to isolation, to keeping her vulnerabilities hidden, even from those she loved. But as she looked into Isaac's eyes, she felt something stir deep within her, a quiet yearning to be understood, to be cared for. The hesitation lingered only for a moment before Isaac's hand gently touched her shoulder, grounding her in a way that words alone could not. "Let me help," he said, his voice soft but firm. There was no hesitation, no judgment, only the simple offer of support. And in that moment, Maria felt a tear well up in her eyes, one she hadn't expected. She wanted to refuse him, to push him away and say that she could handle it. But something inside her shifted. She didn't want to be alone anymore. Isaac's touch was not just a physical comfort, it was a lifeline. It was an unspoken promise that she didn't have to carry her burdens alone. There was no expectation, no demand, just the quiet assurance that he was there, fully present, without needing anything in return. For so long, Maria had pushed away the idea of leaning on others, convinced that it would make her weak. But as Isaac's hands moved with such care, working to ease the tension in her back, she began to understand something she had denied herself for years. True strength did not come from bearing everything on her own. It came from allowing others to see her, to offer support, and to share in the weight of her struggles. Isaac's simple act of care was more than just a massage. It was a reminder that vulnerability was not a flaw, but a part of the human experience that connected them all. She had spent so much of her life hiding behind the walls of self-reliance, but now, in the presence of Isaac's compassion, Maria felt the walls begin to crumble. Slowly, she allowed herself to be cared for, to let go of the pride that had kept her isolated for so long. It wasn't easy, it wasn't immediate, but it was the beginning of something far more profound than just physical relief. It was the beginning of emotional healing, of rediscovering the power of connection. And in that quiet space, with Isaac's touch grounding her, Maria finally understood that sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is allow ourselves to need others. As Isaac's hands moved gently over her shoulders, Maria felt a profound shift deep within herself. The pain in her back had not fully disappeared, but something else had begun to take its place, a quiet, almost imperceptible release. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that was melting away, it was the years of emotional weight, the burden of self-imposed isolation that was slowly beginning to lift. Isaac's touch, simple yet profound, was more than just an act of physical care. It was a bridge that connected them in a way Maria hadn't allowed herself to experience in a long time. For so long, Maria had told herself that strength meant doing everything alone. She had learned to rely on no one but herself, to keep a tight grip on her emotions, and to keep moving forward even when every part of her longed for something more, something deeper. She had convinced herself that to ask for help, to let others see her weaknesses, was to show vulnerability, and vulnerability, she believed, was a weakness. She had spent years trying to guard her heart, building walls to keep the world at bay. But now, as Isaac's hands worked methodically across her shoulders, Maria felt those walls beginning to soften. She had never realized how much she had been denying herself, how much she had been pushing away the very thing she needed the most: connection. Isaac wasn't just offering a massage, he was offering something much more profound. He was offering her presence, understanding and care, without asking for anything in return. In that moment, Maria felt seen, not as the strong, self-sufficient woman she had always portrayed herself to be, but as a woman who was allowed to need, allowed to feel, allowed to be human. And for the first time in years, it was okay. With each steady movement of Isaac's hands, something inside Maria began to shift. It wasn't just about the physical relief, it was about the emotional release that came with it. She felt her own walls, the ones she had so carefully constructed over the years, begin to crumble, not in a sudden crash, but in a slow, deliberate fall. She had been so afraid to let anyone in, so afraid to be seen in her vulnerability, but now, as Isaac's touch moved over her back, she understood. Vulnerability was not a weakness. It was a bridge that allowed connection, allowed healing, and allowed love. For the first time in years, Maria felt the weight of her loneliness begin to dissipate. It wasn't about the absence of her husband. It was the absence of true connection that had left her aching. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she could carry her burdens alone, that to rely on anyone was to risk losing herself. But in that moment, she realized that strength wasn't about bearing everything alone. Strength was about letting others share in your journey, letting them hold you when you couldn't hold yourself. Isaac's care wasn't just physical, it was a reminder that healing happens not in isolation, but in the quiet moments of connection. Maria began to understand that by allowing herself to be cared for, she wasn't losing something. She was gaining everything she had been missing. And with that understanding, something inside her heart began to shift. It wasn't just about the pain in her back, it was about the healing of her soul. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt a quiet peace settle in her heart, knowing that she didn't have to face life's struggles alone. Maria's mind wandered as Isaac's hands continued to move with gentle precision across her back, working the tension from her muscles with a quiet expertise. But as the physical discomfort slowly melted away, something deeper began to surface, something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge for years. The act of being cared for, of allowing herself to lean into Isaac's touch, had stirred something in her that had been dormant for too long. It wasn't just about the release of the pain in her back. It was about the awakening of a vulnerability that she had carefully suppressed under layers of independence and self-reliance. For years, Maria had built a life around the belief that to be strong was to be self-sufficient. She had convinced herself that she didn't need anyone. Her husband's death, though tragic, had only solidified this belief. She threw herself into her work, into her routine, convincing herself that staying busy would keep the grief and loneliness at bay. The quiet ache inside her had become a constant companion, one she hadn't truly acknowledged, and she wore the mask of strength like armor, believing that as long as she appeared fine on the outside, she would be okay. But with Isaac's hands now moving in rhythm with her heartbeat, the walls she had built began to feel less like protection and more like a prison. The realization was slow but undeniable. Her strength had been a facade. It had protected her from the rawness of vulnerability, but had also kept her from the connection she so desperately needed. As the tension in her body faded, Maria's mind began to open, and she allowed herself to see the truth that had always been there, just beneath the surface. Strength wasn't in holding everything together. It was in the ability to reach out, to trust, and to be seen for who you truly were, flaws, fears, and all. The simple act of Isaac caring for her, without asking for anything in return, had shown her that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a strength. It was a profound shift, a realization that left her breathless and trembling. All this time she had told herself that relying on others was a sign of weakness, that asking for help would make her less than the woman she had prided herself on being. But now, in the stillness of the greenhouse, with Isaac's hands soothing the last of the tension in her back, Maria understood. By allowing herself to need others, to be open, she was not losing her strength, she was reclaiming it. There was a quiet power in vulnerability, an unspoken bond that connected people in a way that independence never could. Maria had always believed that love and connection were things she had to earn, that they were rewards for those who had earned them through strength. But now, as Isaac's touch lingered, she understood that connection wasn't something to be earned. It was something to be shared, given freely, without expectation or fear. And in that understanding, she felt a piece of herself return, something she hadn't realized was missing until now. Isaac's care was not just about easing her physical discomfort. It was about showing her that healing, in its truest form, comes not from being self-reliant, but from being open to receiving love and care. In that moment, Maria felt a softness in her heart that had been absent for so long. She wasn't just healing her body, she was healing her soul. She had learned, finally, that it was okay to be vulnerable, that it was okay to let others in, and in doing so she discovered that true strength was not found in isolation but in connection. As the minutes passed, the soothing pressure of Isaac's hands continued to ease the tension in Maria's back, but something deeper was happening within her. It wasn't just about the physical relief, though that was undeniable. It was about something more profound, something that she hadn't allowed herself to confront for years. With every motion, Isaac's touch seemed to dissolve the walls Maria had so carefully constructed around her heart, It was a slow, almost imperceptible process, but it was happening, and it left her feeling raw and exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. Maria had always believed that to be strong, she had to remain independent, that to need others was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. She had spent most of her life convinced that asking for help was a form of weakness, a surrender she couldn't allow. When her husband passed, she clung to this belief more tightly than ever, burying herself in the mundane tasks of everyday life. She told herself that if she kept busy, if she focused on the garden, the house, the endless responsibilities that came with being on her own, the pain would eventually fade. But it hadn't. It had only grown more insistent, hiding in the quiet spaces of her life, and now, with Isaac's touch gently coaxing her to relax, Maria realized how much she had been denying herself. She had denied herself the comfort of connection, the warmth of being cared for, because she was too afraid to let anyone see her in her rawest form. The idea of opening up to others, of letting them in, felt like an admission of failure, as though it would diminish her in some way. But Isaac's presence, his quiet assurance, made her begin to understand something she had never allowed herself to believe. That strength isn't about carrying the weight of the world alone. Strength is about allowing others to carry part of that weight with you, about trusting others to be there for you when you can no longer stand on your own. With every stroke of Isaac's hands, Maria felt the stubborn pride that had kept her isolated begin to loosen its grip on her heart. She had always seen independence as a shield, a way to protect herself from the world's hurts, but now she saw it for what it truly was, a barrier that kept her from experiencing the depth of human connection. She had been living in a quiet prison of self-reliance, afraid that to need anyone else would somehow make her less worthy. But in the tender space between Isaac's touch and her own breathing, Maria understood the truth, that it takes far more courage to open up and be vulnerable than it does to remain closed off, pretending that you don't need anyone. Isaac's simple act of caring for her wasn't just about easing her physical pain. It was about reminding her that to be loved and to love in return were the truest forms of strength. She realized that by allowing herself to receive care, she wasn't giving up her autonomy. She was embracing her humanity. No one could carry the weight of their grief, their loneliness, their burdens alone forever. It was only in sharing that load, in letting others be a part of the healing process, that the pain could begin to ease. In that quiet, transformative moment, Maria made a silent vow to herself. She would no longer push others away. She would no longer hide behind the walls of pride that had kept her from experiencing the fullness of life. True strength, she realized, lay not in isolation, but in the willingness to reach out, to trust, and to let others help carry the load. And as Isaac's hands continued their rhythm, Maria felt a shift deep within her, a softening, a letting go of the self-imposed walls, and the gentle opening of her heart to the possibility of connection once more. As Isaac's hands continued to move across Maria's back, something began to stir deep within her. The physical tension that had once gripped her seemed to melt away with each steady, careful motion. But it wasn't just the relief from pain that Maria noticed. It was the shift in her heart. The quiet but powerful recognition that something was changing inside her. Something that had been buried beneath layers of pride and self-imposed isolation for years. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. Connection was not a weakness, but a necessity for healing. Maria had spent much of her life believing that she needed to carry her burdens alone. She had convinced herself that to ask for help, to lean on others, was a sign of weakness. She told herself that strength was about standing tall, facing the world on her own, and never showing vulnerability. After her husband's death, she had retreated further into herself, burying her grief under the weight of independence. She kept herself busy, tending to her garden, focusing on work, pretending that time would somehow heal her wounds. But it didn't. The ache of loneliness and the unhealed grief never fully went away. They lingered beneath the surface, pushing at her heart every time she was still long enough to feel it. It was Isaac's touch that brought her to the realization. His care was so simple, yet it was exactly what she needed at that moment. He didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't need her to be strong for him. He simply offered his presence, his gentle reassurance that she didn't have to face everything alone. It was in this quiet act of tenderness that Maria began to see how much she had been denying herself, how much she had been missing by refusing to let others in. She had built walls around her heart, walls that had served to protect her from further pain, but also walls that kept her from the love, comfort, and support that she so desperately needed. In the past, the idea of letting anyone see her vulnerable felt like a risk, an exposure that might break her down completely. But as Isaac continued to massage her back, Maria felt something shift. She began to understand that strength wasn't about keeping all the pain inside, about pretending that she didn't need anyone. True strength came from being open to others, from allowing herself to be seen not as the person who could handle everything, but as a person who needed others just as much as they needed her. For the first time in years, Maria let herself lean into the touch, not just physically, but emotionally. It was a surrender, a letting go of the facade she had so carefully constructed. She realized in that quiet, intimate moment that vulnerability wasn't something to hide from, it was something to embrace. By allowing herself to be cared for, by allowing Isaac to offer her this simple act of kindness, she was reclaiming something precious that she had lost along the way, the ability to truly connect. The isolation she had so carefully cultivated began to feel less like a choice and more like a burden. She had built her life around the illusion of self-sufficiency, but now, as Isaac's touch continued to ease her tension, she saw the truth. She had spent far too long believing that to need others was to be weak, when in reality, it was the shared moments of tenderness, care, and vulnerability that made us human. And as the minutes passed, Maria felt a quiet release within herself, a letting go of the weight of loneliness, and a soft opening to the possibility of connection, not just with Isaac, but with the world she had kept at arm's length for so long. In this moment, Maria understood that sometimes the most profound strength comes not from carrying the weight of the world alone, but from sharing it with those who care. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the warmth of Isaac's hands, the steady pressure of his touch, and the rhythm of his movements seemed to create a space of quiet transformation within Maria. The physical relief was undeniable, the last traces of tension slowly dissolving under his care. But what truly left her breathless wasn't just the release of the pain in her back. It was the profound shift that had quietly, almost imperceptibly, taken place in her heart. She had come into this moment with a tightly held belief that she could carry the weight of her life, her grief, and her solitude alone. But now, in the quiet sanctuary of her greenhouse, surrounded by the plants she had tended to with such devotion, Maria realized that she had been carrying a burden far heavier than she had ever imagined, the weight of isolation. For years she had convinced herself that being self-sufficient meant being strong, that to need anyone was a sign of weakness. She had lived her life this way, burying the ache of loss under the constant pressure of maintaining a facade of composure. The loss of her husband had changed everything, but rather than allowing herself the space to grieve and to heal, Maria had thrown herself into her work, her garden, her routine. She had avoided the vulnerability that came with admitting that she needed help, that she needed connection. And in doing so, she had allowed the quiet, persistent loneliness to grow in the shadows of her life. But now, as Isaac's hands continued to move over her back, Maria felt something shift deep within her. She felt the walls she had built around her heart, walls meant to keep out the pain, to keep her from being hurt, begin to crack, slowly but surely. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a gradual, quiet dissolution. And with it, she felt a rush of emotions she had long suppressed: the longing for connection, the need to be seen and cared for, the desire to no longer carry her burdens in isolation. For the first time in years, Maria allowed herself to feel what she had been denying: that it was okay to be vulnerable, to need others, to let go of the pride that had kept her from opening her heart. In the past, Maria had believed that strength came from being independent, from standing alone. She had believed that to ask for help was to expose weakness. But now, as she sat there, bathed in the quiet warmth of Isaac's touch, she realized how wrong she had been. True strength was not found in the denial of need, but in the courage to let others in. Strength was not about holding everything together. It was about embracing the vulnerability that comes with sharing your life with others. The healing that Maria felt in that moment was not just physical, it was an emotional awakening, the beginning of a new understanding of herself and her place in the world. She realized that her isolation had not been a choice, but a defense mechanism, one that had served to protect her from further pain, but had also kept her from the love and care that she so desperately needed. As Isaac's hands moved over her back, Maria felt a new sense of possibility begin to rise within her: the possibility of connection, of opening herself up to others, of allowing herself to be loved, not because she was perfect or strong, but because she was human. And in that understanding, she felt the weight of her loneliness begin to lift, if only for a moment. She wasn't alone anymore, not in this moment, not with Isaac there, offering her care, his presence speaking volumes more than words ever could. It was a reminder that life wasn't meant to be lived in isolation. Healing didn't come from carrying the weight of everything alone, but from allowing others to share in the journey. In that simple, quiet act of care, Maria found a new strength: the strength to let go, to be vulnerable, and to embrace the healing power of human connection.